But in any event, we spent several harrowing hours in the hands of the Gestapo, being beaten up and altogether treated very badly. But they did, because we had this permit to leave Germany in our passports, they did let us go to Belgium. The unfortunate thing was that in Belgium, we were informed that our papers, with the Belgian papers we had, which were pre-war papers, were no longer valid, and that we needed a Belgian visa, new Belgian visa, to be admitted to Belgium. And to make a complicated story and rather simple, we were lucky enough to meet the German consul in Aachen, which is the name of the city where we were, Aachen, and who said, okay, if you come to my office tomorrow morning, I give you the Belgian visas. So we had to return to Germany. And once again, the Gestapo took very good care of us, so to speak. But we did manage to get to the Belgian consulate and get the visas. And then get back to the station to go back to Belgium for the second time. I'm skipping some details of that trip because that would make it too complicated. In any event, the Gestapo were quite ruthless and cruel for no obvious reason whatever. Especially, they beat up my friend, my colleague, very badly.
For no reason?
Well, no reason whatever. To the point where when the train was waiting, he started sobbing loud and clear, and the train was very, very, very quiet, and you could hear his sobs all over the place, and I was sure that the German Gestapo would come back and take us off the train, but somehow or other they didn't, and finally the train started moving and took us to Belgium, a very surprising event. To make a long story short again, we managed to get to Belgium, we managed to get to Brussels, and I even managed to get to become a medical student again for a short while, and I was trying to do something to get my parents out of Poland, but I didn't succeed. And I stayed in Belgium until the next German attack, which was on the 10th of May 1940. And at that time, we escaped to France, enrolled in the Polish army in France, and spent some weeks in France pending German victory, which happened very rapidly. What is interesting is that because I spoke pretty good French and was the only person in my company or in my platoon to speak French, I was put on the road of escape from Paris to Bordeaux, where all the high French officials, all the high officers and things like that were running away from Paris as the Germans were approaching Paris. And I had an inside look at the French collapse before the Germans took over. So it was very interesting because I was stopping the cars, asking for documentation to prevent German spies from infiltrating. They didn't need any spies. The French just collapsed completely. And the cars were usually filled with one man driving, usually a high official, a high officer, his wife, presumed wife, sitting on his right, his mistress and children in the back, and the roof covered with all kinds of garbage, whatever the belongings on top of the roof of the car. That should really be written up as a separate story someday. In any event, then we decided to try to escape to England. and that was in end of June 1940. And then we traveled or walked actually to the town of Saint-Nazaire, which became a big German submarine base during World War II. But there were no boats going to England. And so we stayed in France and avoided the French camps, which were the hospitality camps. And those people who did go to German hospitality camps were taken prisoner by the Germans and spent 5 years in Germany as prisoners of war. And I escaped that together with another buddy of mine. We started walking south in the direction of hoping that we can reach the so-called Free France, which was the southern part of France, which was supposed to be free of German occupation. And to make a long story short, again, we managed to do that. I arrived into the city of Toulouse in the south of France, where by some extraordinary accident, I met old friends of my family who helped me survive a few weeks as a refugee in France. Again, to make a long story short, from there we moved to the city of Montpellier, where I was a part-time medical student. The reason the French authorities would no longer accept Jews as full-time medical students at that time. So I was a part-time medical student, and it may be of some interest in that after the war I got a letter of regrets from the dean of the medical school in the city of Montpellier for having done such terrible things forced by the Germans. But the French were not so unhappy with German occupation until there was a shortage of cheese. By the time the Germans took all the cheese and butter and all the goodies to Germany, and the French had to live on very modest agriculture, that's where the French started saying, oh my God, maybe the German occupation is not such a good thing after all. I spent much of my time as a farmhand. The reason was the only way I could feed myself. So I went to several different places. I was working in the vineyards, I was working in various farms, doing all kinds of chores, and I learned to appreciate provincial French cuisine, as you can imagine under these circumstances. By the way, in the meantime, my parents moved from Lodz to the ghetto of Warsaw, but I was still in touch with them through the intermediary of some friends of mine who were living in Switzerland. So they were writing to Switzerland, and I was receiving the letters from Switzerland wherever I was in France, wherever I was working, or wherever the thing. Finally, in the summer of 1942, it became quite evident that the Vichy people, the French so-called free government, were collaborating with the Germans to exterminate the Jews. And they have done it very effectively. They had the gendarme or the police or whoever capture Jews and deliver them to the Germans, and I was not about to become one of them. So again, I returned to Montpellier, which is where I had some friends, and again, with the help of some friends, managed to get a little money, which I didn't have anyway, and a map, which I still have, showing my route of escape. Then we mapped the way to Switzerland. And I took a train from Montpellier to the Swiss border, and to my shock and amazement, the train was stopped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by French gendarmes who checked the identity papers of all the travelers, and I did not have a valid papers except for a for an old paper which was full of stamps. So I just went to the bathroom and wrote down, this is valid for this part of France, and somehow or other they managed to let me go. It was nearly a miracle for me to have survived this event. And I never really quite understood why this young gendarme let me go, even though if he had only spent 30 seconds looking at my papers, he would have known right away that they were not in good order. But he let me go anyway. And again, so the train reached the end of the line, which is a city named Tournon, which is on the Lake Geneva, on the northern French side. From there, I took a bus to a small village next to the mountains, according to the map which we had drawn in Montpellier, and I still have it. I still have that map.
Were you alone at that time?
Alone, all by myself. And then within the next 2 days, I managed to reach the peak of the mountain, which was the Swiss border. Again, there were several episodes in between that were hair-raising today, but I managed to escape.
Close calls.
Close calls, a lot of close calls. Escaping dogs, escaping border guards and things like that. I made it to Switzerland, and I crossed the border into Switzerland at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was, I think, August 22 or 23, 1942. And then no one would stop me. I was just all by myself walking down the Swiss road as if I were a tourist. No one stopped me, no one asked me any questions, no border guards, no gendarmes, until I came about, I would say, 7 or 8 miles from the border. There was a military compound, and I decided to talk to these people, and I stopped, and I said, I am a refugee from France. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I have nothing to eat or to drink for 24 hours. Would you just give me some hospitality? And the poor soldier was completely bewildered by my request. He called the sergeant called an officer, and the officer finally decided that I could spend the afternoon, the rest of the afternoon and the evening with that little military unit. And the next day, the Swiss gendarmes came, put me to jail, and I spent about 2 weeks in the solitary jail in the city of Martigny, which is in the southern part of Switzerland, and they wanted to ship me back to France. And I wrote an article about this, which is now on the internet, why I'm eternally grateful to the Swiss for having saved my ass from destruction at a time where people were complaining that the treatment of refugees by the Swiss was not so good. I thought being in a Swiss jail was vastly superior to being in a German concentration camp, that's for sure. So after this, they finally let me stay in Switzerland as a refugee. They sent me to another jail where they had a sort of camp for political refugees, where I spent about 4 months. We were meeting people from all over the world who were incarcerated in that same jail. And as the Allies advanced, and since actually the treatment in the Swiss jail was pretty miserable until Stalingrad. When the Germans got defeated in Stalingrad in January 1943, there was a radical change in the behavior of the Swiss guards towards the political prisoners. And shortly thereafter, they released me from the jail, and they put me into a camp where I met many different friends, a camp we were working, trying to plant some tomatoes for the Swiss. It was not far from Zurich, and after a few months in that camp, they finally released me to study, and I selected the city of Bern. And I went to study medicine in Bern, and I spent 3.5 years there. In the meantime, I found out, and I thought that I found out, that my parents and sister were no longer there because the correspondence with them through the Swiss friends stopped, and there were no further news. And then oddly enough, the extermination of the Polish Jews by the Germans was never widely advertised in the Swiss press, and I think in any press, whether it was European or American press. But the underground information started seeping in, and that the people, the Jews from Warsaw, were being exterminated massively, millions of people. And I realized that my parents and sister I'm never going to hear from them again. And that was a difficult and tragic point in my life. And then until such time where I decided that the rest of whatever career I was to have, it should be to honor the memory of the departed, and I have done that. My main books, of which you can see a copy if you go to the living room, is dedicated to the memory of my parents and sister, and has been since its first edition. It's now in its 5th edition, and it's still performing the same primary goal. So, in the meantime, I had a complicated family life because I got married to a girl who had a family, and with whom we had 2 children. But unfortunately, the family proved not to be so nice. So ultimately, we came to the United States in 1947, and that was the beginning of my American life. Yes.
John.
Upon arrival in the United States with my Swiss diploma, I managed to get a job of an intern in the Bronx hospital, which was called Lincoln Hospital, where the time which I dedicated to the improvement of my English, because I knew practically no English upon arrival in the United States. And I took the licensing examination in the state of New York, and to my amazement, I passed it on the first try. My career then became oriented towards the study of cancer, and after having spent some time at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, where I got training as a pathologist, I managed to secure a position at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where I became a pioneer in using cell studies known as cytology, C-Y-T-O-L-O-G-Y, as cytology for the diagnosis of cancer. And that has become my primary interest in my medical study. I was a pioneer in this regard. I wrote some of the very first books on this topic, and I wrote a very large number of research papers. Except for an interval during which I spent 2 years serving in the United States Army, mostly in Korea, I was a member of the staff of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center until 1970. At that time, the issue of my future became acute because it was not a very tolerant hospital, and I was a candidate for a chair there, and because of my origin and background, it was extremely unlikely that I would get the job. So I left, went to Baltimore for 3 years, and returned here to become a chairman at the Montefiore Medical Center, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which is where I spent the rest of my career until today. We did an enormous amount of investigative work. We had a very large laboratories supported by federal grants, and the career led to considerable recognition of my accomplishments, both in the United States, but also abroad. And I can say without much hesitation that I was an invited guest to virtually every civilized country on Earth, except New Zealand. I've never been invited to New Zealand, but I was all over the world, and my name became associated with the development in this field of cancer cytology until today. So today I'm sort of chairman emeritus of the Department of Pathology, and then I still work a little bit and give some lectures and conferences every once in a while, trying to keep informed. Lately I have been ill. I couldn't really do very much of anything, although I'm now somewhat better. Nonetheless, the most difficult time for me occurred in May of 2008, when my wife, whom I loved very dearly, died. And she was an extraordinary companion, and I miss her very much.
You want to talk about the 3 children and what they are doing right now?
I have 3 sons.
3 sons.
One is an architect. We're living in Chicago, and is working for the United States government maintenance as one of these maintenance offices. The second son, his name is Michael. The second son, Andrew, is a high officer in the State Department. He's currently working as counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, and is planning to retire in another year and a half or something like that. The youngest son, his name is Richard. He is living in Boulder, Colorado, and he is a very intelligent, smart young man who never achieved any high education, but is working as a contractor and is very happy doing just that. I have 4 grandchildren, one unfortunately ill with Down syndrome, so-called trisomy, and 3 very accomplished grandchildren, one who is becoming a medical doctor in May of 2009 at Northwestern University in Chicago. Another one who is just graduated from Boston University is working for Harvard, and a boy who is working for IBM, and this seems to be got masters in computer sciences from the University of Chicago, and is doing very well. I have no great-grandchildren yet.